Okay, let's dive into this. There's that old saying, it may be dangerous to be America's enemy.
But to be America's friend is fatal. Yeah, it's a pretty stark quote.
And looking at some potential U.S. policy shifts regarding Ukraine, you kind of wonder if they might be feeling that right now.
Well, what's really interesting, I think, is how former President Trump's view on the Ukraine conflict seems to have evolved or at least shifted publicly.
Right, he seems supportive of aid initially, but now the talk is all about striking a deal, specifically with Russia.
Exactly. And it's not just talk about a deal. It sounds like quite specific and potentially major concessions are on the table for Moscow.
Yeah, things like Ukraine potentially ceding territory, lifting sanctions, maybe even pulling back U.S. troops in Eastern Europe,
Mm.
and possibly blocking Ukraine from joining NATO.
And the flip side, or what seems to be missing, is what Russia is offering in return. Publicly, anyway, it doesn't seem like much.
Which brings us to the big question, right? Why give up so much? What's the underlying strategy here?
Well, the thinking seems to circle back to China. Trump himself has said in the past, pretty clearly, he doesn't want Russia and China aligned.
He wants to unite them, I think was the phrase he used.
That's the one. It fits this larger strategic idea that maybe the U.S. should prioritize containing China, which some see as the bigger long-term challenge.
Rather than getting bogged down completely in the Ukraine war.
Precisely. And in
Mhm.
that kind of calculation, Ukraine, unfortunately, starts to look less like the main focus and more like, well, maybe a pawn in a much larger game.
It has echoes of that Kissinger Cold War strategy, doesn't it? Engaging China to isolate the Soviets.
It definitely has those echoes, divide and conquer. But here, the potential cost for Ukraine losing territory, losing that NATO aspiration, really underlines that grim, fatal friend idea.
So how realistic is this? Do Russia and China even buy this strategy?
Well, it's pretty safe to assume they're aware of the possibility, and Beijing certainly hasn't been sitting still. They've been actively strengthening ties with Moscow.
We've seen that, right? Diplomatic overtures, nuclear talks.
Joint naval drills, China pushing Russian goods internally, record oil imports from Russia. The trade volume between them is hitting all-time highs.
It looks like a very deliberate effort to deepen that relationship.
It does. Now, we should mention, as our source material points out, a lot of the detailed info on their coordination comes from government reports, so, keep that context in mind.
Sure, always good to consider the source.
But the overall trend seems clear, and it's built on a couple of key things.
Like a shared distrust of U.S. dominance, neither of them seems thrilled with the current world order.
Exactly. They see a strategic partnership as mutually beneficial. China really became Russia's economic lifeline after Crimea in 2014, and the war has just cemented that.
So Russia depends on China for imports, exports, just basic economic stability now.
Pretty much. And it's not just money. There's military cooperation, too, joint exercises, sharing intelligence.
It seems like their strengths kind of complement each other. Russia's resources and tech, China's industrial might.
That's a good way to put it. Together, they represent a significant counterweight, especially across Eurasia, which is definitely something the U.S. watches closely.
And from Russia's perspective, okay, maybe they don't love being the junior partner to China, potentially.
Probably not ideal for them in the long run, but right now, China is that crucial economic support. And as China grows stronger globally, Russia sees the alliance as a way to stay relevant, to push for that multipolar world they talk about.
So it's not just reacting to the U.S., it's a core strategic move for Russia now, this pivot to China.
It seems to be, yes. Which really brings us back to the challenges facing Trump's strategy. How do you break that up?
Okay, so if this Russia-China bond is getting stronger, what makes trying to split them so difficult now compared to, say, the Nixon-Kissinger era?
Well, the biggest difference is the starting point. Back then, you had genuine, deep hostility between the Soviet Union and China, ideological splits, border clashes. That animosity just isn't there between Putin's Russia and Xi's China today.
Right. They see common ground against the U.S. And hitting reset with Russia now seems incredibly hard, with all the sanctions and how Europe sees Russia.
Very difficult. European allies, especially in the East, view Russia as a direct long-term threat. It's hard to imagine them just welcoming Russia back into the fold.
Plus, what could the U.S. realistically offer Russia that China isn't already providing?
That's the key question. China offers massive economic support, diplomatic cover in places like the UN, and a huge growing tech sector. It's tough for the U.S. to match that package right now, especially given the political climate.
And you mentioned other potential concessions besides Ukraine.
Yeah, the source material we looked at suggests talk within Trump's circles about possibly pulling U.S. troops out of NATO countries that joined after 1990.
Wow. So Poland, the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria.
Exactly. Countries like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. We're talking about potentially thousands of U.S. troops, particularly in Poland and the Baltic states, as of a couple of years ago.
And that would address a long-standing Russian complaint about NATO expansion.
Right.
They've always seen that as provocative.
Absolutely. They view NATO bases moving closer to their borders as a fundamental security threat. So withdrawing those troops would be a huge concession from their perspective.
Okay, what else? There was something about aid programs.
Yes, potentially cutting U.S. funding for democracy promotion programs abroad. These initiatives, often run through organizations like USAID, have supported groups critical of the governments in both Moscow and Beijing.
Which Russia and China definitely don't like. They call it meddling.
They do. They see it as interference in their internal affairs. So ending that funding could be seen as another way to appease Moscow, removing an irritant in the relationship.
Even if it means losing some of that American soft power, the influence that comes from promoting certain values.
That would likely be the trade-off, yes. Things like educational exchanges, support for independent media, cutting those, could reduce goodwill and understanding in the long run, but might be seen as a necessary step for this specific strategic goal.
So you add it all up. Ukraine concessions, troop withdrawals from Eastern NATO allies, ending democracy aid. It paints a picture of a really radical potential shift.
It really does. A major reshaping of U.S. posture, all seemingly aimed at getting Russia to help counter China.
But it feels like such a massive gamble. Is there any solid reason to think Russia would actually ditch China, even for all that?
That really is the core uncertainty, isn't it? Like we said, the dynamic isn't like the Cold War. Today, it's more about shared interests and economic necessity for Russia and China. Russia would surely welcome the concessions.
Of course.
But would they fundamentally change their strategic alignment away from Beijing? There's not much hard evidence to suggest they would. You have to ask, though, could relying so heavily on China create its own problems for Russia down the line, another form of dependence?
That's a good point. And there's the time factor, too. Even if a deal happens, Trump's term is limited. Putin's likely planning much further ahead.
Exactly. From Moscow's view, any deal with a specific U.S. administration might look temporary. Their relationship with China probably feels more stable, more predictable right now.
And the risk to the U.S. alienating NATO allies seems huge. They see Russia as the main threat, not necessarily China in the same way, especially in Europe.
It's a massive risk. Rebuilding that trust, that alliance cohesion, if it's damaged, that takes a very long time. You could lose influence that's hard to get back.
And imagine if the whole strategy just doesn't work. If Russia takes the concessions and stays aligned with China anyway, the damage to U.S. credibility, the sense of betrayal in Ukraine and among allies.
The fallout could be immense and potentially long-lasting, which sort of brings us to the situation in Ukraine right now. It seems to be getting more dangerous, which might be adding urgency to this push for a deal.
Right. We're seeing reports that the Biden administration has okayed Ukraine using some long-range missiles, ATACMS, Storm Shadow, against targets inside internationally recognized Russian territory.
Yeah, not just in occupied areas, but places like Bryansk, Kursk. These are sophisticated systems, a definite step up.
And Russia's reaction.
They're seeing it as extremely escalatory. Putin's basically said Ukraine can't operate these things without direct NATO help targeting technical support.
So in their eyes, it's like NATO is now directly attacking Russia proper.
That seems to be their perspective, yes. They see it as bypassing their nuclear deterrent. Attacks on Crimea were one thing, but hitting recognized Russian territory is viewed differently.
And Russia updated its nuclear doctrine recently, didn't they? Lowering the threshold.
Reportedly, yes, back in November 2024. The suggestion is they might consider using nuclear weapons sooner, maybe even against a non-nuclear state like Ukraine, possibly as a demonstration.
That's deeply concerning, and there have been some signals.
There have. A nuclear-capable missile was fired towards Dnipro, probably unarmed, but a clear message. And then that drone attack on Chernobyl that damaged the radiation shield. Thankfully, no leak reported, but still incredibly reckless.
Wow. Okay, so all these events, the missile use, the Russian reactions, the nuclear posturing, it really amps up the danger level.
It absolutely does. And you can see how that might fuel the urgency for someone like Trump to say, look, we need a ceasefire now, even if it means Ukraine gives up a lot.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. We're looking at a potential, quite radical shift in U.S. strategy.
Yeah, the idea being offer Russia major concessions on Ukraine, maybe on NATO's posture, sanctions relief, hoping to pull them away from China.
But this is happening while Russia and China seem closer than ever, economically and strategically.
Right. And the war in Ukraine itself is escalating, becoming more dangerous, raising nuclear risks, which adds pressure to find some kind of off-ramp.
It's an incredibly complex picture with huge potential consequences.
Absolutely. And that really leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty profound question to think about. Is this gamble, this attempt to completely realign global powers by trying to unite Russia and China, worth the potential price? The price being possibly alienating key allies and effectively sacrificing a partner nation's sovereignty.
And what are the consequences for global stability in the long run if this path is taken, whether it succeeds in splitting Russia and China or not? Something to definitely keep thinking about.